Random House Audio presents The Illustrious Dead, the terrifying story of how Typhus killed Napoleon's greatest army. By Stephan Talty. Read for you by Stephen Hoye. Introduction. Old Bones. In Lithuania, late in the winter of 2001, construction crews began clearing a piece of land in that part of the capital, Vilnius, known as Northern Town, digging trenches for phone lines and demolishing the old Soviet barracks that had stood on the land for decades. Vilnius was booming, with new money flooding in and decades of oppression under Moscow and Berlin seeming at last ready to vanish, along with the last physical traces of imperialism. Real estate developers had snapped up the old troops' quarters to be made into Look's new homes for the computer programmers and regional managers who would soon turn this forbidding collection of buildings into a sparkling hub of the new Europe. The work had gone smoothly until one bulldozer scraped up a layer of soil and uncovered something white underneath its blade. The operator looked down and saw bones that were quite clearly human. Femurs, ribs, skulls. One worker later told a reporter that the white things wouldn't stop coming out of the ground. There were thousands of them. Word spread to nearby neighborhoods, and men and women came hurrying across the fields, their boots crunching in the hoarfrost and their breath blowing white. There had been whispers for years about this place. Rumors that the KGB had used the barracks as torture chambers for political dissidents. Many believed that those who hadn't survived the questioning had been buried in mass graves somewhere on the grounds. 8 years earlier, a grave filled with 700 KGB victims had been found a few hundred yards away. The local people looked down into the freshly dug hole, looking for missing lovers, sisters, or sons. Or perhaps these were the corpses of Jews murdered by the Nazis. Hitler's bureaucrats had set up 2 ghettos in the city after occupying it in June 1941, and then slowly drained them of men, women, and children, eventually killing 95% of the country's Jewish population. When archaeologists from the University of Vilnius arrived, they saw that the bodies had been stacked 3 deep in a V-shaped trench, and quickly realized that the men had been buried in the same pits they had dug to defend themselves. Clearly the men were soldiers, not dissidents or civilians. And there were robust specimens, many of them tall and broad-shouldered, most between 15 and 20 years old, with a few women mixed in. Prostitutes was the early guess. As they excavated the 2,000 skeletons, the archaeologists found a plaque that had once adorned a helmet, decorated by an eagle and a cockade in faded red, blue, and white. There were curious belt buckles inscribed in several languages, buttons with regiment numbers such as 29 and 61, and there were, crucially, 20-franc coins that dated from the early 1800s. The remains were too old to be the victims of either Stalin or Hitler. After quickly calling to mind the history of Vilnius, called the city built on bones because of its past as a minor bauble for conquerors and tyrants, the scientists realized they could only be looking at the remnants of one force, the Grande Armée. 189 years before, Napoleon had led 600,000 men into Russia in an attempt to conquer his last major opponent on the continent. These corpses were the remnants of that invasion force. The dead were from every corner of Europe: Holland, Italy, Spain, Germany, Westphalia, and other duchies, kingdoms, and states. Napoleon had ruled all of them and had in 1812 been at the coruscating height of his power, leading an army unlike anything that had been seen since the days of the Persian conqueror Xerxes in the 5th century B.C. The soldiers were the paragons of their time, and on their march to Moscow they had been considered unstoppable. But they had clearly encountered something beyond their power to overcome or outrun. What had killed these men? None of the remains had the crushed skulls or telltale bullet holes of men who had been executed and dumped in mass graves. The bodies were curled into the fetal position, the normal human response to extreme cold, which had certainly played a part in their demise. Hunger, too, had ravaged the city in the winter of 1812. The archaeologists remembered the stories of Napoleon's troops breaking into the local university and eating the human and animal specimens suspended in formaldehyde. Some of these men had starved to death. But something else had clearly been at play in that awful year. The soldiers had been physical specimens, the toughest of a gargantuan, battle-hardened army who had managed to escape the fate of their less determined or less robust comrades lying in roadside graves all the way to Moscow and back. These men were the survivors of something even more cataclysmic that had occurred many weeks earlier. In a sense, they were the lucky ones. The archaeologists drilled into the teeth of the corpses and extracted samples of dental pulp, placed it on slides, and slid them under microscopes. In the DNA of a number of the soldiers, they discovered the signs of the hidden killer that had done so much to bury not only the Grande Armée, but also Napoleon's hopes of world domination. Older than France or Europe or Homo sapiens themselves, its causative agent had arisen millions of years ago. It had mystified and slain its scientific pursuers for centuries, complicating the race to understand and defeat it. And it had a past as fearsome as any of the mass killers of the 20th century, only more illustrious and strange. Chapter 1. Incarnate. It would be a remarkable thing to look at a map of the world in 1811 and not be struck by how much of it was controlled by France and its 42-year-old leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. His writ ran from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Russia, and from southern Spain to northern Germany. Some 45 million subjects lived under his rule. One exhausts superlatives in talking of his kingdom. He held sole command of a nation that was the richest and most powerful on earth. His empire was larger than the Roman emperors or Charlemagne's, and it had every promise of expanding in the near future. And Napoleon commanded it with such rigor that no detail, down to the opening time of the opera in Paris, escaped him. The emperor had not only conquered territory, he had remade societies. Coming of age during the reign of Louis XVI, Napoleon and his generation grew disgusted with a nation where the accumulated layers of tradition and artifice clogged one's path in life, and money and prestige flowed to the amoral and the cunning. They felt suffocated by the weight of the past, its irrationalities, its injustices. After taking power in France, Napoleon had streamlined the nation's administration, rationalized its civic laws and its economy to free up long-suppressed energies, and exported these innovations to the satellite nations under his control. He'd famously declared that careers should be open to the most talented, and in many ways he'd succeeded in moving European societies toward a future where merit, brains, and hard work counted. When the young general took power, he was seen across much of Europe as a kind of mythological creature, half warrior, half idealist. For those with any progressive ideas whatsoever, he was the strong man who would give order and structure to the best instincts of the French Revolution. Emerging from the whirling blood feuds of the Terror, during which thousands were executed on the slightest pretext, when men ran through the streets hoisting the body parts of princesses stuck on pikes, Napoleon had saved the nation. Our politics today are divided between left and right, liberal and conservative. But those notions gain their heat and shape from Napoleon's times. He came of age during the birth of those concepts, between the French Revolution's insistence on individual dignity, rights, and freedoms, and the Anglo-American conservative response inaugurated by Edmund Burke in his landmark Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, which stressed the value of tradition, caution, and social norms built up over time. The temperature of the early 1800s burned much hotter than that of the early 2000s. The eruption of the Revolution threatened to sweep away all accumulated notions of social place and long-held values, and to leave in their place pure chaos. Rulers eyed their subjects nervously, and subjects eyed their kings with the new idea that they were hateful and unnecessary. Europe in Napoleon's time seemed ready to fly apart.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?